We're taught that help deserves thanks. But what happens when gratitude isn't offered freely, when it's expected, measured, and enforced? On one stage, wealth demanded appreciation. On the same stage, silence refused to comply, and revealed how power really worked in a winter night in Atlanta. The city's elite gathered beneath vaulted ceilings and deliberate lighting, where philanthropy was usually presented as grace rather than power. The Caldwell Foundation Centennial Gala had been staged as a celebration of progress, a carefully choreographed evening meant to reassure donors, partners, and civic leaders that generosity could still feel elegant. Crystal glasses caught the light. A string quartet softened the air. Every detail whispered refinement, restraint, and moral certainty. This was not a place for discomfort. It was a place designed to confirm beliefs, not challenge them. Serafina Caldwell arrived with the ease of someone accustomed to being read before she spoke. Cameras followed her movements with practiced intimacy, capturing angles that suggested effortlessness rather than calculation. She wore wealth like a finished argument, not flashy, not apologetic, but unmistakably deliberate. To the audience, she represented a rival, a woman who had crossed every invisible line meant to stop her, a billionaire whose philanthropy had funded scholarships, renovated housing blocks, and anchored policy conversations. She was proof that survival could harden into legacy. What the room could not see was the cost of being permanently symbolic. Serafina had learned early that her presence never belonged entirely to her. Every step she took was interpreted as evidence of something larger than herself. To some, she was inspiration. To others, an obligation fulfilled. To many, she was reassurance that the system worked if one endured long enough. The applause that followed her was warm, sustained, and subtly demanding. It asked her to keep proving what she had already proven. The gala unfolded with practiced efficiency. Board members circulated with smiles calibrated to signal openness without vulnerability. Donors exchanged anecdotes about impact, referencing numbers and neighborhoods with the same ease others used to discuss travel. The language of giving floated through the room in polished phrases, carefully stripped of friction. Help had been delivered. Lives had been improved. Gratitude, though rarely spoken aloud, was assumed to exist as a natural byproduct of generosity. Cameras played their role with discipline. They searched for faces that could carry the night's meaning. They lingered on moments that would translate well into highlight reels and annual reports. The goal was not simply to raise funds, but to reinforce a narrative where charity resolved complexity. In this story, benevolence moved downward, appreciation moved upward, and everyone left lighter than they arrived. The stage at the center of the ballroom was arranged like a place of testimony rather than celebration. The lighting was brighter there, sharper, designed to separate those who watched from those who were watched. It suggested order. It suggested consequence. What should have been a platform for gratitude began to resemble something closer to evaluation. Not everyone noticed the shift, but it was there, subtle and deliberate, shaping expectations before anyone spoke. Serafina took her seat near the front, aware of how often her face would be searched for cues. She understood the unspoken agreement of nights like this. She would embody generosity. The recipients would embody success. Together, they would complete the story. It was a structure she had helped build, even as it exhausted her. The foundation's leadership believed in clarity. Impact needed faces. Progress needed proof. Tonight would provide both. The concept of success stories had been introduced earlier in the evening, framed as evidence of transformation. These were individuals selected not only for their resilience but for their ability to reflect well on the institution. The audience leaned forward with interest, ready for affirmation. They expected inspiration that would feel earned but uncomplicated. They expected gratitude that would feel sincere but contained. What few considered was the invisible pressure placed on those chosen to represent change. Being lifted onto a stage meant being asked to compress an entire life into a digestible narrative. Complexity was inconvenient, ambivalence was dangerous. Gratitude was not optional, it was currency. Those who offered it fluently were rewarded with applause, access, and continued support. Those who hesitated risked being misunderstood. The foundation's staff moved with quiet urgency as the program progressed, checking timing, adjusting positions, ensuring that the sequence of events unfolded without disruption. They believed in what they were doing. They believed structure protected everyone involved. Yet structure, when left unquestioned, could become a form of pressure disguised as opportunity. As the night approached its pivotal moment, anticipation sharpened. The audience had been primed for resolution. The story needed its closing arc. The cameras repositioned. The lighting intensified. The music softened to a respectful hush. This was the moment meant to justify the evening, the moment that would be replayed and shared as proof that generosity had landed where it should. Two teenage boys were guided toward the stage, framed as beneficiaries, described as examples of impact. Malik Turner and Isaiah Brooks stood at the edge of the light, their posture careful, their expressions unreadable. They were dressed appropriately, aware of the room's expectations without fully belonging to them. To the audience, they were silhouettes waiting to be filled with meaning. Serafina watched them with a practiced sense of anticipation. She had seen this moment many times before. A few words of thanks, a nod toward opportunity, a promise of a better future. It would complete the cycle. It would reassure everyone present that the exchange had been fair. She expected the script to unfold as it always had. The spotlight widened, enclosing the boys in brightness that felt less like welcome and more like exposure. The room leaned forward collectively, prepared to receive what it believed it had earned. Serafina waited for gratitude to arrive on cue, unaware that silence was about to fracture the narrative she had helped sustain. Malik Turner and Isaiah Brooks were not standing on the edge of the stage to celebrate anything. They were there to endure it. Every step they took inside the ballroom felt less like an invitation and more like an examination. The brightness of the lights, the polished floors, the quiet confidence of the people around them all carried the same message. This was not built for you, but you are expected to behave as if it was. Their silence was not accidental. It was learned. Over time, it had become the safest way to exist without being misread. Malik had learned early that attention was rarely neutral. At 17, he carried himself with the alertness of someone who had been responsible for too much, too soon. His eyes moved constantly, tracking people, exits, signals of threat or opportunity. He did not relax in unfamiliar spaces because experience had taught him that relaxation was expensive. Someone always wanted something in return. Help, especially, came wrapped in expectations that were never fully explained. Malik distrusted generosity that arrived with smiles too wide and instructions too vague. He had learned that the moment you accepted assistance, your choices were no longer entirely your own. Responsibility had shaped Malik more than age ever could. He understood bills, deadlines, and consequences in ways most adults avoided thinking about. When something went wrong, he did not ask why, he asked how to fix it before it spread. That instinct had kept him afloat, but it had also taught him to speak carefully, if at all. Words could be used against you. Silence, when deployed correctly, could not. Isaiah Brooks stood beside him, quieter in a way that often went unnoticed until it mattered. Where Malik scanned outward, Isaiah folded inward. His intelligence did not announce itself. It lived in his ability to notice patterns others ignored, in the way he absorbed information without revealing how much he understood. Isaiah carried grief that had never been given space to become a story. Loss had entered his life early and stayed without explanation. He did not speak about it because there had never been a safe place to do so. Isaiah had learned that showing emotion invited interpretation. People were quick to label, to decide what his feelings meant about his character or his future. So he learned restraint. He learned to keep his expressions minimal, his reactions controlled. Silence, for him, was not defense but containment. It kept the weight from spilling out in ways he could not afford. Their environment had trained them both. Unstable housing meant never fully unpacking, never trusting that a space was permanent. School was not a refuge but another system to navigate carefully. Teachers rotated, administrators changed priorities, funding appeared and disappeared without warning. Promises were made with enthusiasm and broken with paperwork. Side hustles were not about ambition, they were about keeping momentum just long enough to avoid falling behind. Institutions had disappointed them with consistency. Programs arrived with banners and slogans, then vanished once the photo opportunities were exhausted. Adults spoke about potential as if it were a favor rather than a fact. Malik and Isaiah learned to expect withdrawal where commitment had been implied. That expectation shaped how they listened and how they responded. Their relationship was not built on sentimentality. They did not exchange long conversations about dreams or fears. Instead, they functioned as tactical allies. Each one knew what the other could handle without explanation. When Malik took the lead, Isaiah observed. When Isaiah withdrew, Malik compensated. They were witnesses to each other's reality in a world that often refused to see them clearly. Trust for them was not emotional, it was operational. They had accepted the invitation to the gala for reasons that had little to do with celebration. Opportunity had been presented as a narrow doorway that could close without warning. School administrators had encouraged them to attend, framing it as exposure, as gratitude, as a necessary step toward future support. The promise of resources hovered just close enough to feel real. Scholarships, mentorship, stability, all the words that sounded like relief. Neither boy believed in free offerings. Experience had taught them that nothing arrived without expectation. Assistance came with forms, with appearances, with unspoken rules about behavior and tone. They understood that participation was a kind of contract, even when the terms were unclear. Still, refusing outright felt riskier than compliance. Saying yes was sometimes the only way to delay consequences. As they moved deeper into the ballroom, Malik's attention sharpened. He noticed details others ignored. A Foundation staffer stood near the stage, holding an envelope that did not match the evening's aesthetic. It was plain unmarked and clutched with intent. Malik recognized the posture. It was the posture of someone waiting to collect something. Conditions. Signatures. Compliance. The brightness ahead grew more intense as they approached the edge of the stage. Applause swelled, not for them as individuals, but for what they represented. Malik understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever was inside that envelope had not been discussed. Whatever was expected had not been agreed upon. The silence he and Isaiah carried tightened, no longer just habit but preparation. As the lights closed in and the room leaned forward, Malik realized that survival tonight would not depend on what they said. It would depend on what they refused to give. Serafina Caldwell had stood on stages her entire adult life, and she knew how moments were supposed to move. They followed a rhythm that rewarded preparation and punished hesitation. The applause rose, the story landed, the proof was delivered, and everyone left reassured that meaning had been exchanged fairly. When Malik and Isaiah stepped forward and did not speak, that rhythm broke. The pause stretched beyond what etiquette allowed, beyond what patience excused. It was a silence that did not ask permission to exist. At first, Serafina assumed it was nerves. She had seen it before, young people overwhelmed by scale and attention, momentarily frozen by the weight of expectation. The room waited generously for a few seconds longer, confident the script would correct itself. But the seconds kept passing, and nothing filled them. No thank you. No practiced acknowledgement. No verbal confirmation that the system had worked as intended. Something tightened inside her, subtle at first, like a misalignment she could not immediately name. The gala was not simply an event. It was an argument she had been making for years. Her foundation represented effort rewarded, survival transformed into structure. These boys were meant to close the loop, to validate the logic that had governed her entire life. Their silence felt like an interruption, not just of the program, but of meaning itself. Serafina leaned forward slightly, her expression still composed, but her attention sharpened. She felt the collective uncertainty ripple through the room. Donors shifted in their seats. Board members exchanged quick glances. Staffers along the perimeter adjusted their posture, ready to intervene if needed. Cameras hesitated, unsure which angle to commit to. The night's narrative hovered in suspension, waiting for resolution. When Serafina spoke, her voice carried farther than she intended. It was not raised in anger, but in certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from believing one is right. She addressed the boys not as adversaries, but as participants who had missed their cue. Her words framed gratitude as acknowledgement, as respect, as the bare minimum owed to a process designed to help them. The tone was firm, public instructional. She believed what she was saying. Every part of her history supported it. She had grown up counting what was missing, learning early that nothing was guaranteed. She had fought her way through systems that were not built to protect her, absorbing humiliation and doubt as the cost of progress. She had endured conditions, scrutiny, and expectations placed on her long before she had language for them. Gratitude to her had been survival. It had been the price of admission. In her mind, the logic was unassailable. She had taken nothing she had not earned. She had built institutions where none existed. She had redirected wealth toward opportunity, housing, education. She had created pathways that saved people from the instability she once knew intimately. The world had not given her grace freely. She had learned to perform it. Why, then, was it unreasonable to expect acknowledgement in return? The room absorbed her words with mixed reactions. Some nodded along, relieved that authority had stepped in to restore order. Others smiled uncomfortably, sensing the shift from celebration to correction. A few donors looked down at their programs, suddenly aware of how exposed the moment had become. Foundation staff moved closer to the stage, their focus no longer on presentation but containment. Phones lifted almost instinctively. The glow of screens punctured the darkness like quiet witnesses. People recorded not out of malice but reflex, aware that something unscripted was unfolding. Whispers traveled faster than sound, interpretations forming before facts could settle. Two teenagers, once framed as beneficiaries, were now positioned as subjects in a public lesson about gratitude and responsibility. Malik and Isaiah remained still. They did not respond with defiance or apology. They did not fill the space Serafina's words had opened. Their silence, now charged with attention, began to read differently. What at first appeared as hesitation was being recast as resistance. The room's patience thinned, and judgment crept in to replace curiosity. Serafina continued, her words expanding beyond the boys to the audience itself. She spoke about opportunity, about respect, about the importance of recognizing those who made sacrifice possible. The message was not cruel, but it was uncompromising. It carried the weight of personal history transformed into universal expectation. Gratitude, in her framing, was not optional. It was a moral obligation. As she spoke, the cameras committed. The moment was no longer private enough to retract. Every sentence hardened into record. The boys' faces, lit starkly by stage lights, became symbols onto which the room projected its assumptions. They were young, quiet, and unyielding, and that combination unsettled people more than anger ever could. Malik listened without moving. He understood the rules of attention well enough to know that reacting would only feed the narrative being constructed around them. But as Serafina spoke, something shifted. The demand for gratitude, delivered publicly, stripped the offer of help of its generosity. It transformed it into leverage. Malik felt the calculation settle in his chest with clarity. This was not about appreciation. It was about control. When Serafina finished speaking, the room waited again, this time with sharper expectation. The pause returned, heavier than before. Malik lifted his head and met her gaze directly. There was no challenge in his expression, no resentment or submission, just steadiness, an unmovable presence that refused to perform the role assigned to him. For a fraction of a second, Serafina faltered. The look unsettled her in a way she could not immediately explain. It did not accuse her, but it did not absolve her either. It reflected something back at her that she had spent years avoiding. And as the silence deepened, she felt the first crack form in the certainty she had just declared. The refusal did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came as stillness, deliberate and controlled, settling into the space Serafina's words had left behind. Malik and Isaiah did not argue, because argument would have acknowledged the terms being imposed on them. They did not plead because pleading would have confirmed that gratitude was a debt they were expected to pay. Instead, they remained where they were, bodies steady, expressions restrained, allowing the silence to carry what words would only dilute. For Malik, the decision was instinct sharpened by experience. He understood traps that disguised themselves as opportunities. Once you stepped into the script, once you began explaining yourself, you surrendered control of how your actions would be interpreted. Any response could be edited, reframed, or weaponized. Stillness denied that process. It offered nothing to manipulate. It was not defiance, but it would be read as such by anyone invested in authority being obeyed. Isaiah followed Malik's lead without needing instruction. He had learned that emotional restraint could be a form of self-preservation. In environments where power waited for missteps, saying less reduced the chances of being misunderstood. Silence, when intentional, created a boundary that others were forced to confront. It required patience to maintain, especially under pressure, but Isaiah had spent years practicing that patience in places far less forgiving than a ballroom. The room struggled to process what it was witnessing. People were accustomed to conflict looking loud, messy, and easily categorized. This refusal was none of those things. It was calm, contained, and therefore unsettling. Without an emotional display to respond to, the audience searched for meaning elsewhere. Some interpreted the stillness as disrespect, others as ignorance, a few as insolence. Rarely did anyone consider it might be a choice. A board member near the front leaned toward a colleague, whispering with visible irritation. In his mind, the boys were failing a basic test of decorum. He saw their silence not as caution, but as a challenge to the hierarchy that made evenings like this possible. Order depended on participation. Gratitude was part of the agreement, even if it was never written down. Their refusal threatened that order. A Foundation staffer stepped closer to the stage, her expression tight but professional. She gestured subtly, attempting to prompt a response that would smooth the moment over. The movement was small, but Malik noticed it immediately. It was the gesture of correction, the same one teachers used when a student answered incorrectly, the same one administrators used when compliance was expected without discussion. Malik did not move. The longer the silence stretched, the more the room filled it with assumptions. Society had trained itself to read young black boys through a lens of suspicion, especially when they did not perform expected emotions. Calm was misread as calculation, stillness as threat. The absence of gratitude became evidence of ingratitude. The absence of fear became defiance. The boys' refusal to explain themselves allowed these projections to multiply unchecked. Isaiah felt the shift before he fully understood it. The air around them changed, tightening with expectation. He could sense how quickly perception was turning, how easily the narrative was slipping out of their control. He had seen this pattern before in classrooms, in offices, in meetings where silence was interpreted as guilt. The difference here was scale. This was not a single authority figure misreading them. This was a room full of power deciding what their silence meant. Consequences began to form quietly, almost invisibly. Scholarships that had been discussed in vague, hopeful terms suddenly felt conditional. Doors that might have opened now seemed precarious. Administrators back at their school, eager to maintain good standing with donors, would likely interpret the incident through the same lens as the crowd. Malik understood that nothing would need to be said explicitly for punishment to follow. Systems were efficient that way. Yet even as the weight of potential loss pressed in, Malik did not regret the choice. He had seen what happened when gratitude was extracted publicly. It did not protect you, it bound you. Once you performed thankfulness on command, you became a tool for reinforcing someone else's narrative. Silence, at least, left space for truth to exist later, even if it came at a cost. Isaiah's attention shifted back to Serafina. While much of the room focused on the boys, he watched her closely. He noticed something beneath the controlled exterior, something flickering just behind her composure. It was not only anger that tightened her expression. It was fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of appearing foolish in front of an audience she was meant to command. Fear that her generosity, publicly questioned, might lose its authority. That realization unsettled Isaiah more than the demand itself. He saw, with unexpected clarity, that the confrontation was not only about them. It was about Serafina's need for affirmation, for proof that her giving still carried moral weight. Their silence threatened that proof. It suggested that help could exist without obligation, and that possibility destabilized the logic she relied on. Around them, the gala began to fracture into parallel realities. On the surface, the program attempted to move forward, speakers adjusting remarks, applause arriving late and uneven. Beneath that, conversation sparked quietly. Phones emerged openly now, recording angles and reactions. People sensed that something had gone wrong, and instinctively tried to capture it before it slipped away. Malik felt the eyes on them, the collective decision forming that they would be remembered not as recipients, but as a problem. He also knew that once the moment escaped the room, it would no longer belong to anyone present. The story would be told elsewhere, by people who had not felt the weight of the lights or the pressure of expectation. It would be simplified, sharpened, and shared, as if confirming that fear. A journalist near the back of the ballroom raised her phone higher than the rest. Nora Vance had been scanning for a moment all evening, something that would cut through the predictable narratives of philanthropy. She framed the boys in her shot, capturing their stillness against the grandeur around them. Within minutes, she posted the clip with a headline that reduced the complexity to a provocation, framing the silence as ingratitude. By the time the gala resumed its scripted flow, the video had already begun to travel, carrying a version of the truth that would ignite outrage far beyond the ballroom walls. By morning, the gala no longer belonged to the people who had been in the room. The story had escaped its original context and reshaped itself into something sharper, simpler, and far more combustible. What had been a complex, uncomfortable moment was reduced to a single provocation that traveled fast because it felt familiar. Across screens and platforms, the question repeated itself with relentless efficiency: shouldn't they be grateful? Social media transformed the silence into a referendum. Clips looped without framing, captions supplied intent where none had been stated, and certainty replaced curiosity. Commentators debated tone and entitlement as if they were moral absolutes. The boys' faces became placeholders for arguments people were already eager to have. Few asked what had been promised. Fewer asked what had been demanded. Almost no one asked the boys what they had experienced. Cable panels followed the same script with better lighting. Analysts framed the moment as a cultural failure, a breakdown in values, a warning sign about youth and respect. The discussion moved quickly from the specifics of the event to abstractions about responsibility and gratitude. The more generalized the conversation became, the less room there was for nuance. Complexity did not trend, judgment did. Serafina watched the narrative harden from behind closed doors. Advisors flooded her schedule with calls and memos, urging restraint publicly and resolve privately. The consensus was clear. Any sign of self-doubt would be interpreted as weakness. Her brand, built over decades, depended on authority and clarity. She had been positioned as a model of discipline and uplift. Backtracking would invite scrutiny not only of the incident but of her entire legacy. The advice was consistent and strategic. Stand firm. Emphasize values. Do not engage with critics who would twist uncertainty into guilt. Gratitude, they argued, was a reasonable expectation, and reasonable expectations did not require apology. Serafina listened, nodding where appropriate, but the certainty that had carried her through the gala no longer felt as stable. The viral conversation had stripped her words of intention and repackaged them as doctrine. Meanwhile, Malik and Isaiah felt the consequences immediately, though no one named them as such. At school, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Teachers who had once been encouraging grew cautious. Administrators avoided direct conversation, communicating instead through policy language and scheduling changes. A counselor suggested, without explanation, that Malik keep a lower profile for a while. Community reactions were divided, though rarely balanced. Some adults framed the boy's silence as embarrassment, advising them to apologize and move on. Others treated it as a personal failing, a lack of appreciation for opportunity. Online harassment filled the gaps left by official responses. Messages arrived from strangers who felt entitled to instruct them on humility, respect, and their place in the world. The volume was overwhelming and the intent was rarely benign. The boy's silence, once a protective choice, became raw material. People projected onto it whatever confirmed their existing beliefs. To some, it was arrogance. To others, ingratitude. To a smaller group, it was evidence of manipulation by unseen forces. The absence of an explanation allowed imagination to run unchecked. Silence, when removed from context, proved infinitely interpretable. Malik struggled with the weight of being misread at scale. He had known the risks of staying quiet, but the speed with which the story solidified still stunned him. There was no opportunity to clarify without appearing defensive. Any attempt to speak now would be filtered through assumptions already in place. He understood that the narrative had momentum, and momentum favored those who controlled platforms, not those caught inside the frame. Isaiah withdrew further, not out of fear but exhaustion. Watching strangers argue about their character felt surreal. He recognized the pattern from smaller moments in his life, now magnified beyond anything he had imagined. The difference was permanence. Once a clip circulated widely, it never fully disappeared. The internet remembered selectively and rarely kindly. Nora Vance watched the engagement metrics climb with professional satisfaction and personal unease. Her post had traveled farther than she anticipated, drawing attention from national outlets and new followers. She told herself she had captured a moment, not created one. Yet as commentary escalated, she began to notice what the clip did not show. The lead up, the pressure, the context that complicated the headline she had chosen. Doubt arrived quietly, then lingered. Nora replayed the footage, aware of how easily framing could imply motive. She considered posting a clarification, maybe a follow-up that acknowledged the limitations of the clip. Each time she hovered over the option, the numbers refreshed. Engagement rewarded simplicity. Ambiguity slowed the feed. Correcting the record would dilute the moment that had elevated her visibility. Back at the foundation, internal conversations took on a defensive edge. Staff members documented reactions, categorized risks, and drafted statements that emphasized values without conceding fault. The boys' names appeared less frequently in these discussions, replaced by references to optics and precedent. Decisions were framed as necessary protections rather than punishments. Malik learned of the shift through an email that arrived without warning. The message was polite, clinical, and carefully worded. It informed him that his scholarship review had been paused pending further assessment. No timeline was provided. The reason cited was brief and devastating in its vagueness, character concerns. He read the sentence multiple times, absorbing its implications. Nothing in the email accused him of wrongdoing explicitly. It did not need to. The pause was enough. It signaled that silence had been interpreted as a flaw, not a choice. That judgment, once recorded, could follow him far beyond this moment. As Malik closed his inbox, he understood that the cost of becoming a symbol had just become tangible. The argument playing out across screens was no longer abstract. It had reached into his future, quietly altering its shape, and the question he faced now was not whether the story was fair, but how much more it was prepared to take from him. Long before Serafina Caldwell became a name spoken with admiration and caution, she was a child learning how temporary everything could be. Her earliest memories were not anchored to a single home but scattered across apartments that changed with circumstance. Leases ended abruptly. Utilities failed without warning. Stability was a rumor adults discussed but rarely delivered. Her mother worked relentlessly, stretching hours and patience thin, carrying exhaustion like a second skin. Love was present, but so was scarcity, and Serafina learned early that need was not something the world responded to gently. School offered promise and punishment in equal measure. Teachers noticed her intelligence quickly, but attention came with conditions. Praise was often followed by disbelief, as if her ability required verification. She was encouraged but also isolated, marked as an exception rather than a student. Being exceptional brought access, but it also came with exposure. Mistakes were magnified. Success was interrogated. She learned to anticipate doubt and answer it before it could settle. Her brilliance opened doors that would otherwise have remained closed, but every door demanded something in return. When her first scholarship arrived, it was not simply financial relief, it was a contract disguised as opportunity. She was asked to share her story publicly, to stand on stages and embody perseverance in a way that comforted donors. Gratitude was not suggested, it was required. Thankfulness became performance, and performance became survival. She learned to smile on cue, to compress pain into digestible narratives, to speak about struggle without revealing how deeply it had shaped her. Each retelling sharpened her control over the story, but dulled her relationship to the truth. She understood quickly that dignity was negotiable. To keep eating, to keep studying, to keep moving forward, she had to give something up. That something was privacy. Over time, she convinced herself that the transaction was fair. She was gaining access, security, a future that had once seemed unreachable. The cost, though heavy, felt justified. Weakness, she decided, was a luxury she could not afford. Vulnerability invited exploitation. Gratitude, when demanded, became armor. It signaled compliance and kept the help coming. As Serafina rose, she internalized a lesson that would quietly govern her choices for decades. Control prevented humiliation. Structure protected against chaos. If she could define the terms, she could avoid being defined by others. This belief hardened as her influence grew. When she began giving back, she did so with precision. Her philanthropy was generous, but it was also curated. Stories were selected carefully. Outcomes were measured. Representation mattered. She told herself she was creating opportunity, not extracting it. Yet beneath the language of impact lived an unspoken rule: recipients needed to reflect well on the system that supported them. Gratitude became a signal that the exchange was complete. Without it, the giving felt unfinished, even suspect. Praise confirmed purpose. Silence threatened it. Publicly, Serafina spoke about empowerment and access. Privately, she feared irrelevance more than criticism. She had spent too many years fighting invisibility to tolerate it now. Without acknowledgement, her giving felt hollow. Without appreciation, she worried that her sacrifices, both past and present, would dissolve into anonymity. Gratitude, loudly expressed, reassured her that she had not endured for nothing. The viral backlash reopened wounds she had carefully sealed. Advisors framed the moment as a misunderstanding, a misstep by unprepared recipients. But alone, Serafina replayed the silence from the stage and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her certainty. The boys' refusal unsettled her not because it was rude, but because it mirrored something she had buried. They had done what she never allowed herself to do. They had withheld performance. Late one evening, she requested internal reports, not for optics but for clarity. She wanted to understand how the moment had been constructed, how the boys had been selected, what promises had been made. The documents arrived slowly, filtered through layers of language designed to minimize liability. Still, patterns emerged. Emails referenced impact positioning. Schedules were adjusted without consultation. Consent was assumed rather than confirmed. What she discovered unsettled her more than the public criticism ever could. Malik and Isaiah had not been fully briefed on the expectations placed upon them. Their appearance had been framed as an honor, not an obligation. The envelope Malik noticed had contained releases and behavioral guidelines prepared in advance, intended to formalize a performance after it had already been extracted emotionally. Staff members had made decisions in the name of efficiency, confident they were serving the Foundation's mission. Serafina recognized the logic immediately because it was one she had once lived under. The system prioritized narrative cohesion over individual autonomy. It justified pressure by invoking opportunity. It blurred the line between consent and compliance. Seeing it reflected back at her, now wielded by people acting on her behalf, forced a reckoning she had long deferred. For the first time since the gala, her anger lost its footing. It was replaced by something heavier and more precise. Responsibility. Not abstract, not shared, but personal. She had built an institution that mirrored the conditions she once resented, only with better lighting and legal language. The realization did not absolve the boys of anything, but it reframed the moment entirely. As Serafina closed the reports, she understood that the night had not gone wrong by accident. It had unfolded exactly as the system she designed allowed it to. And now, with the truth pressing in from all sides, she faced a choice she had avoided her entire life. Whether to protect the structure that elevated her, or confront the cost it demanded from those still standing where she once stood. The truth did not arrive with emotion or accusation. It arrived quietly in paper and language, in clauses that had been written long before Malik and Isaiah stepped onto the stage. It was procedural, unremarkable in appearance, and devastating in implication. The envelope Malik had noticed that night resurfaced days later, handed to them by a school administrator who framed it as routine follow-up. There was no apology in the delivery, no acknowledgement of what the document represented. It was treated as paperwork that should have already been understood. Malik read it carefully, line by line, because he had learned that danger often lived in what people assumed you would skim. The document was a release form paired with behavioral expectations tied to future aid. It outlined participation requirements for foundation-sponsored opportunities, framed as guidelines rather than demands. The language was polite, clinical, and intentionally vague. Gratitude was never named as an obligation, but it was implied through phrases like positive representation and alignment with organizational values. Isaiah noticed how often the document referred to them not as students but as participants. Their presence at events, their images, their stories were listed as assets that could be used across platforms. Photos, appearances, and testimonials were included as standard components of engagement. Even silence was addressed indirectly, categorized as conduct that could be interpreted as misalignment. The contract did not require consent explicitly, it assumed it. What unsettled them most was how familiar the structure felt. This was not an anomaly. It was a template. The document had been designed for efficiency, meant to be signed quickly and filed away. It relied on the imbalance of power to function smoothly. Malik understood that many people before them had likely signed without question, grateful for the opportunity and unaware of the cost. When they brought the document to their school counselor, the response was cautious but revealing. The counselor did not deny the pressure. Schools, she explained, competed for foundation dollars. Programs depended on maintaining good relationships with donors. Students who received attention were expected to justify the investment. The language shifted subtly as she spoke, moving from concern to pragmatism. This was how the system worked. No one was forcing them, but refusal had consequences. Kids became currency in this framework, valued for their ability to attract resources rather than for their autonomy. Malik listened without interrupting, recognizing the resignation in her tone. She was not defending the system so much as admitting her limited power within it. The truth was not hidden. It was normalized. As the implications settled in, Malik felt the anger he had been holding sharpen into clarity. The gala had not been a misunderstanding. It had been the public execution of an unspoken agreement. Gratitude was not requested because it was assumed. Their silence disrupted that assumption, exposing the mechanics behind the performance. Across the city, Serafina confronted the same documents from the opposite end of power. Her legal team explained the framework with professional detachment, emphasizing compliance and precedent. Everything, they assured her, was standard. Releases protected the foundation. Guidelines ensured consistency. The system allowed generosity to scale. Serafina listened, hearing echoes of explanations she had once accepted without question. For the first time, she allowed herself to see the structure without the language that had justified it. The contracts did not create opportunity. They managed perception. They transformed people into proof. The realization stung because it implicated her not as a distant benefactor, but as an architect. Her philanthropy, built to avoid exploitation, mirrored it instead, only with softer language and controlled lighting. The anger she had felt toward Malik and Isaiah began to reframe itself. It was no longer directed at their silence, but at what that silence had forced her to see. She had demanded gratitude not because she was owed it, but because she needed reassurance that she was not perpetuating harm. The demand had been a defense against shame. This recognition marked a pivot she could not undo. Serafina understood that acknowledging the truth would destabilize the Foundation's narrative and her position within it. Yet denying it would require doubling down on a system she now recognized as flawed. The choice ahead was no longer about optics. It was about integrity. Meanwhile, Nora Vance received the contract through an anonymous source who understood its significance. She read it with professional interest, immediately recognizing its potential impact. This was not a viral clip, this was evidence. It reframed the entire incident, shifting the question from gratitude to consent. Publishing it would challenge powerful institutions and invite scrutiny of her own role in amplifying the original narrative. As she weighed the decision, her phone rang. The call came from Serafina's legal team, their tone measured and courteous. They acknowledged Nora's interest and offered her an exclusive interview, framed as an opportunity for deeper context. The implication was clear without being stated. Access in exchange for discretion. Nora ended the call without committing, aware that the choice before her mirrored the one facing everyone else in this story. Protect the system and benefit from proximity to power, or disrupt it and risk isolation. As she stared at the contract on her screen, she understood that whatever she chose next would determine not only how the story was told, but who it ultimately served. The consequences of the gala did not remain abstract for long. They settled into the boys' lives in quiet, grinding ways, turning stress into something physical. Isaiah felt it first. His grades, once steady despite chaos, began to slip as concentration became harder to maintain. Homework piled up unfinished, not because he did not understand it, but because his mind refused to stay anchored. At home, conditions worsened. The fragile arrangements that had barely held began to fracture under new pressures, and the sense of safety he had built through routine dissolved. Isaiah stopped talking about school altogether. He moved through his days with minimal expression, conserving energy for survival rather than ambition. Teachers noticed the change but interpreted it through familiar frameworks, disengagement, attitude, lack of motivation. The context that might have explained his withdrawal remained invisible. Isaiah learned again what he had learned many times before. When pressure increased, systems rarely adjusted. They waited for failure to justify intervention. Malik responded by tightening control. He picked up more hours at work, accepting shifts that left him exhausted but solvent. Missing school became a calculation rather than an accident. Each absence felt like a trade education exchanged for immediate stability. He told himself it was temporary, that he could manage both if he stayed disciplined enough. Responsibility, he believed, was something you could outrun with effort. But effort had limits. Malik carried not only his own stress, but Isaiah's as well, monitoring his moods, checking in without asking questions, trying to anticipate collapse before it happened. He avoided discussing the gala, the scholarship pause, the online noise. Silence, he thought, was still protection. If they endured long enough, maybe the storm would pass. The night it didn't arrive with warning. Isaiah failed to come home at his usual time. At first, Malik assumed delays, then distractions. As the hours stretched, unease sharpened into fear. Calls went unanswered, messages remained unread. Malik retraced familiar routes, checking places Isaiah sometimes went when he needed space. Each unanswered question tightened the knot in his chest. When Isaiah finally appeared hours later, he was not injured, but he was empty in a way Malik had never seen. The disappearance was not dramatic. There were no sirens or confrontations. Isaiah had simply walked until he could no longer feel the weight pressing on him. He had sat somewhere public and visible, letting time pass because he did not know where else to put himself. The moment forced clarity Malik had been resisting. This was not a phase. They were not weathering a temporary setback. They were slipping, quietly, through gaps that closed faster the longer no one intervened. Silence was no longer neutral. It was complicit. That night, Malik accepted what he had been avoiding. Staying quiet had not protected them. It had isolated them. The system was interpreting their restraint as weakness, as admission, as consent. If they did not speak now, the story would harden permanently, and Isaiah might not survive the weight of it. Malik began to gather everything he had dismissed as background noise. Emails from school administrators that hinted at expectations without stating them outright. Messages from Foundation staff that framed appearances as opportunities while attaching obligations. The release forms that assumed compliance. Notes from counselors that suggested cooperation as the path of least resistance. Individually, each piece could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that could not. He organized the evidence carefully, understanding that how it was presented mattered as much as what it showed. This was not about anger. It was about structure. It was about demonstrating that gratitude had not been freely offered because it had not been freely requested. It had been demanded through implication and consequence. As Malik worked, he felt fear sharpen into resolve. Speaking carried risk, but silence carried certainty. He thought about Isaiah sitting alone, absorbing pressure without language. He thought about futures quietly narrowed by decisions made in rooms they were never invited into. The choice became unavoidable. Nora Vance's name hovered at the edge of his thoughts. She was the one who had amplified the original moment, who had shaped the narrative before they understood what was happening. Malik did not trust her, but he recognized her reach. If the truth was going to disrupt the story already in motion, it needed a platform powerful enough to challenge it. Semping the evidence felt like stepping into open air without knowing where the ground was. Malik attached the documents, wrote a message that explained without pleading, and pressed send before doubt could reclaim him. The act itself was quiet, anticlimactic, but its implications were vast. Almost immediately, uncertainty flooded in. Nora had choices, incentives, and pressures Malik could not see. She had already demonstrated a willingness to prioritize impact over accuracy. There was no guarantee she would use the information to correct the record. She could ignore it, bury it, or reshape it into something else entirely. As Malik closed his laptop, the risk settled fully into place. He had broken the silence that had defined their survival strategy. What came next would depend on forces far beyond his control, and for the first time, he understood that telling the truth did not guarantee protection. It only guaranteed that the truth could no longer be ignored. If this story made you uncomfortable, it means it did something honest. Stories like this survive only when they're carried forward, not ignored. If you believe moments like these deserve to be seen and remembered, keep this conversation alive beyond this video. Your support helps stories that question power reach people who need to hear them. When help comes with expectations, is it still generosity, or just another way to stay in control?